Most of you here on the room, and probably most of you on Zoom as well, are quite familiar with our guest this evening. She's had a very long, productive career as a legislator and in public service before that. Her biography describes her as a social justice advocate, clean energy and climate change trailblazer, and accomplished legislator. She's about to complete her 8th year in the state Senate, having served 6 years in the Assembly. Before that, she served on the board of the East Bay Regional Parks District, a former small business owner, very active in East Bay Women's Political Caucus and making sure that more women get active in politics. She's fought passionately for numerous environmental causes, which, as I said, is how I really started following her career and got to meet her. There have been so many social justice issues that she has really been the proponent of, including prison terms, gun use, equity for college athletes, in addition to numerous environmental causes. Originally, I think it may have been the styrofoam ban that really got me excited. More recently, she's been very active in what she said on an interview, housing, housing, and housing. We will be talking about both of those this evening, so let me give a warm, extremely warm tonight, Hillside Club welcome to Nancy Skinner. So this interview was planned for over a year ago, and it was supposed to occur on the first Monday of February. And that night, there was a special event in the Senate. We had to cancel. So we are holding it instead on a night that is bittersweet in the world, certainly. The anniversary of the terrible events in Gaza. And I can only hope that events like this that encourage more public discourse and civic engagement can help internationally in creating peace. So with that, I would actually say that I'm a little pleased that we're now doing this interview towards the end of her career, because we can really look back. And we're not going to just do a retrospective. You could do that online. Hoping that this will truly be, as it said in the advertisement, a candid conversation. I know Nancy to be a very candid person. Not just a look back, but a look way back and behind the curtains, if you will, to see what it is like to be a legislator and a public servant, especially someone who serves so long. So with that, let me just set a couple of ground rules. We're not going to have open questions, but if any of you do have questions for the senator, there are 3x5 cards that are on the table when you came in. Kat will be collecting them towards the end and giving those to me, and we'll try to get in as many as we can. I already have a few questions that people have given me in advance. And then it's our hope that we'll be doing an interesting and deep dive into a few topics. Of course, we could be here a week to really go into all of the things and all of the topics that she's covered during her period of service. So let me start on a more personal note. I recently received, as a constituent, an email from you, Nancy, that was advertising a fundraiser for you, and this subject line was best job ever. You want to share with us why, for you, you've had the best job ever?
Well, some of you may not know this because obviously I've been in a lot of elected positions, but I was a very reluctant candidate to the state assembly. So that was 2008. I had not been in office. I was on the East Bay Regional Park District Board, but I had served in the Berkeley City Council in the 80s and then hadn't been in elected office for a good long time, 14, 16 years. And so the idea that I could mount a campaign of the size that you do for an assembly district, and that I would be able to, both be relevant and communicate why I should get elected and raise the money. So I was, and then I think this is a common perception when we look, most everybody we know is very active in the federal. They're very concerned legitimately about president, about Congress, about Senate. But at least my experience is not very many people think about the state offices, and they don't really think about what it is the state can do. And I was a victim of that. I thought, well, why would I want to be in state government? What is the state? And then I started thinking about it. And of course, the state government, clearly the federal government's very important. However, in terms of our day-to-day lives, like our local city government, the state has much more impact on us, much more. Our schools are funded by the state. Other than our city's planning powers, our housing is pretty much, it's very much impacted by the state. All of our policies around criminal justice and sentencing and crime and all of that, state. We could go on and on, right? But, it took me a while. So then I was one of the last entrants into that race, but I won. And I get to Sacramento, and I hadn't spent much time in Sacramento. I had helped many other people get elected. I'd helped Talani Hancock. I'd helped Barbara Lee when she ran for state senate, but I didn't spend time in Sacramento myself. So it was really like a foreign place to me. And I went to the speaker then, Karen Bass, and I had, only met her once before. And I said, Karen, or Speaker Bass, I was still that kind of relationship that I could only, she's now mayor of LA. And I said, Speaker Bass, I don't really, I know that my values are very close to what my constituents' values are because I've lived there for so long, and I really, I know that they trust me and that the kind of things I'm interested in, they are interested in, but I don't really know what I do here, and I don't know if my skill set, because really, to be honest with you, I'm an organizer. And can you use organizing skills here? And she's like, she looked at me and she goes, absolutely. And I was like, oh. And then she said, are you willing to let, me take you under my wing? And I said, yes, please, be my mentor. And then she asked me, are you policy or politics? Now, yes, I'd been in office, but, I hadn't stayed in elected office. It obviously wasn't the first and foremost thing on my mind. And yes, I'd helped some people, but really I was doing all kinds of other work. And I looked at her and I thought, well, politics. And of course, that was one of the things that kept me from making a decision to run, was this whole politics. But I looked at her and I was like, oh, it took me a while to answer. And I finally was like, politics, because that's how we'll get good policy. And she said, right answer. Yeah. And then now I didn't fully understand it, but within just a couple of months, what the legislature is, it's a team sport. You can't do anything without the support of your colleagues. And obviously, I love this district I represent. So the Senate district, for those of you who might not know, it's almost 1 million people. It goes from San Leandro, it's the I-80 corridor, from San Leandro, Island of Alameda, all the way up, all the communities along the I-80, all the way up to Rodeo. And with a little teeny bits of exception, everybody in this district, they're voters, they're civic minded, they're active, they're educated, they've got opinions. I just love this district. And I knew that my core values were really close. So I knew that I wanted to deliver for this district, but I knew that, I was already pegged like, oh, she's Berkeley, and communist, People's Republic, et cetera, et cetera. But of course I wanted to deliver on those progressive things. So how was I going to get the votes, both in the Senate and the Assembly, if I'm asking people to stretch? Because the kind of stuff that we often support is a stretch for people. So I realized I needed to get to know my colleagues. I needed to have great relationships with them. I needed to stretch for them at times, and then they would stretch for me. But anyway, so the long and short of it is, I fell into it like a fish in water. And I just set my mind that if I was given the privilege to be in this role, then I had to do my very best to deliver really impactful things that would change people's lives. And I feel very proud I was able to do it.
Thank you, and thank you for your service. So you actually started out here in Berkeley at the Berkeley City Council as a student.
Yeah.
Very first one, I believe.
Grad student. But.
Yeah. What was it as a student, even grad student? I mean, most of us were just trying to get reasonable grades. What was it that made you willing to step into public service, even at that role at that time?
Well, the first time I ran, I didn't think about being on the city council. It was, I don't mean to sound cavalier, but the then Progressive Coalition that backed Ron Dellums, that backed Tom Bates, Lonnie Hancock, later Barbara Lee, that Progressive Coalition, it's a shadow, doesn't really exist now. But then, first it was called the April Coalition and then Berkeley Citizens Action. They had a tradition of running a student. And they ran a student for council to be a get out the vote measure to get students to vote. And so I first learned about BCA because in the student co-op I lived in, a young man, Jeff Rudolph, was a student there, and he was recruited as the BCA candidate. And so of course, all of us who lived in the co-op, he was our like roommate or whatever. We walked precincts for him, and that's how, and then I met Florence McDonald. Anyway, so no student had ever won. And I figured, oh, well, I walk precincts anyway, I might as well run. I didn't think that I would become elected because students never won.
Oops.
Yeah, but anyway, but I was active. I had been on the city's public works, solid waste management commission then. So I was active in environmental things, mostly in the community, things around recycling and issues like that. So I already had a lot of involvement in city policies, and then I was active on the campus around issues like the South Africa divestment movement.
So from Berkeley City to state assembly and then to state senator, help us understand the differences between the roles of an assembly person and a senator. By the way, I've asked this question in preparation for a number of people, and besides knowing that the Assembly has 80 members and the Senate only has 40, most people were not able to answer much about the question. So this is Civics 1A.
All right, well, local city council and mayor, those are harder jobs. That sounds funny, but it's a harder job because as much as the state's decisions really impact people, you feel more the decisions of your local council, like whether your street's paved, your sidewalks all cracked up, did the garbage get picked up, is the recycling working, is any number of things, is your favorite library maintaining the hours that you were hoping, all of those issues. And so that sounds like, big deal, but the challenge is when you're in local elected office, because you have to, part of your role is not just making all kinds of good new policy, but making sure that the city is operating and delivering its services. And people expect that. And it's a hard job. And of course, in Berkeley, people really have strong opinions on no matter what the issue is. And of course, they want the council to get involved in everything, whether they should or shouldn't. And it's a hard job. The legislature, you're a little bit more removed from that kind of public scrutiny. And the main real job is to, again, figure out how to talk about the issue that you're working on in a way that would cause more of your colleagues to support it, and then understanding how to navigate, because there's all these committees, you have to go through a committee process, and there's lots of things that can hang you up there, and knowing those staff and making sure that you never insulted any of them because they have short memories. And then, of course, making sure working with the governor's office, because ultimately your bill has to be signed. So that's a kind of, it's almost prescriptive. It doesn't mean you can guarantee the outcomes no matter how well you do it, but it's kind of prescriptive. Whereas local, I mean, it just much more, it can be more chaotic and yeah.
And between the Assembly and the Senate, are we seeing dramatic differences between?
The Assembly and the Senate, I mean, that number difference. So you need 41 votes minimum to get out of a bill out of the Assembly, and you need 21 votes minimum to get out of the Senate. And really, it's a numbers game, it's a counting game, and you got to count a lot more votes in the Assembly. So when you're not in it, when being in it, I did great because I knew everybody in it. Once I became a senator, I went out of my way to stay in good relationship with as many as possible, but it does get a little more difficult because you're not sitting with them day to day. You're not on committees with them and such. And so you don't get to see that kind of, what's that particular, it's funny, but it's so human nature. I mean, people really, all of this is about, like when you, any organization you're in or business you're in, you're watching your colleagues, you're taking cues from, what sets them off, what doesn't. And if you want to have good relationships with them, you try to do your best not to set them off. So when I didn't get to have that as much day-to-day interaction, say with the Assembly, I had to, rely on other Assembly members who were my friends to ask them, so tell me a little bit about person X or person Y, what should I watch out for? But those are the big differences.
So let's then talk about the topic, favorite topic of both of us. I'm a realtor, and Nancy's been chair of the Housing Committee for the Senate, a very important role. So just for a little bit of context, back since 2016, one source I read said something like 100 laws have been passed in California related in one way or another to housing. Yeah. Very, very hot topic. We wanted to take a look, sort of follow an issue from inception through bill and then through implementation and results. So an obvious one is SB 330. Okay. And the follow-on SB 8. Actually, why don't we start for the benefit of the audience and people who haven't been becoming a policy wonk quite as much as I have in the last month, to summarize.
330? Okay. Arlene, if you don't mind indulging me for just a moment, I'll be very brief as to how why is housing so important to me? Between being on council and then, so I left the council in 92 and I got elected to the Assembly in 2008. In that period, 92 to 8, I was working on the climate crisis. We didn't call it the climate crisis then. We called it more in the early days, global warming. And I was one of the founders of an international association, and one of our signature projects, which I was one of the people that launched, was called Cities for Climate Protection. And most of the jurisdictions, most of the cities all around us were part of that. And so you hear a lot about cities having climate action plans, having a greenhouse gas reduction goal or a carbon reduction goal. All of that came out of that Cities for Climate Protection, because every city who was part of it had to make commitments to analyze how their decisions affected the greenhouse gases in their community, to make set a target and do various things. So, okay, here I am leading these cities, trying to figure this out. And the first thing they had to do is, all right, what are the sources of emissions in your community? They had to do an emissions inventory. Common now, but not common then. So you look at, and back then you think about, say, a city like Berkeley, and people think, oh, electricity, everybody wanted solar. And that was before the current solar. We're talking, whatever. I mean, we've gone through waves. And everyone was kind of fixated on, we just going to green energy. But when we did the emissions inventory for all of the coastal communities in the state of California, this is back in the early 90s, The number one source of emissions, transportation. Why? So cars, vehicles. Why? Anybody want to make a venture or guess? Because you had to drive everywhere. Because all of our land use policies were such that you were dependent on your car, schools were far from homes, services were far from homes, jobs were far from homes, and there was little to no transit. And believe it or not, even back in the 90s, what they call the carbon coefficient of electricity in California was very low. We had nuclear, we had natural gas, we had no coal, not no coal, but it was very low. And so everybody going to solar, and that I'm a huge advocate of solar, so I don't mean to in any way, but you were better off getting rid of the natural gas in your house, which is of course a big discussion now, but there was more, your carbon was in your car, in your vehicle miles traveled, and your natural gas use. That was it. And so all of a sudden I had to have this aha moment, because I didn't even know, and I'm like, whoa. And then you start looking at why. Well, it's because of like how we zone. About, I'm going to get the number wrong, but it's in the 80 some odd percent of the land in California zoned for residential purposes is zoned for single family homes, which is the least efficient from a transportation point of view and from other points of view too. And so anyway, so I first had this aha moment about carbon and climate change, and then I was, there was some discussions in Berkeley. This was when Livable Berkeley started, and Dorothy Walker, I started sitting down with her, and she would describe other factors about housing. And then, of course, as we saw more and more people unhoused, unable to afford housing, I'm thinking, you know, here we are in the wealthy state, in a wealthy city, and we have unhoused people. This is just morally bankrupt. And our housing decisions are causing us to be worse from a climate crisis. And yet, and this is not without a disparagement towards the residents of Berkeley who felt this way, Berkeleyans were very attached. I want my neighborhood just as it is. And any type of, new housing or such was really resisted and very much looked at as something negative and evil and only to benefit developers, instead of as something that could benefit the planet, could benefit people because it could maybe bring down the price, not initially, not when it's first built, but over time. And anyway, so that's how I got obsessed with housing. And there were some other reasons too, but we'll leave it at that. So when I watched my colleagues do bills and they were trying to increase density, and I knew, and I didn't oppose that, but I knew that they were going to come up against that same kind of attitudes like that, Berkeleyans have. And so I sat down with a close friend of mine, Denise Pinkston, and I said, Denise, what can we do? What's just logical? And the state had there already was something called the Housing Accountability Act, and we'll get into that a little bit, but the state already required each region, and so MTC is the entity in our region that had to do this, that had to make projections on what was the housing need in, say, 10 years. And if I'm just going to be arbitrary now, but if 250 units was the housing need in over 10 years, then what was each jurisdiction's responsibility? 50 units here, 25 units there. Of course, it's much bigger, but I'm just giving you that as a number. And so communities they were already supposed to zone and plan for X number of more units. And so even the city of Berkeley they zoned for more units. So all the cities around here. But every time a project would come to the planning department, then someone would appeal it, would have to go to the zoning board, or would have to go, anyway, it would be, so even if the project met the rules, so submit it, and it could be a homeowner who is submitting that project, or a larger developer, or just a little developer. Even if they met the rules, it could take year, 2, 3, 4, 5 or more years to get approved. And if it was affordable housing, it took even longer, up to 10 years. So I thought, Denise and I just sat there and we thought, what if you had just the green light? If you follow the rules, you are going along with what your city's zoned for, and you submitted your application, shouldn't you have some assurance that you're going to get the yes? So SB 330, which we called the Housing Crisis Act, it was purely the simple concept if housing applications that played by the rules should get a green light, only so many hearings, and not be delayed. And that's what that bill did. And that if a city didn't, that there would be consequences. And it's been a game changer.
So we'll start with that. That was clearly the concept with a really strong motivation and some moral cause as well. You make its way through. Well, actually, help us understand how it makes its way through from that idea, that motivation, that great idea, to wording that actually becomes
law.
Yeah.
Well, it got signed by the gov. Yeah. Okay, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with the film director Hitchcock. Have you heard the term the MacGuffin? All right, so mystery or detective writers use this too, where you design the plot where you have the MacGuffin to direct your attention elsewhere, right? So then you don't figure out who did it because you're going after this shiny object. Well, I was fortunate, not only fortunate, this was kind of we were conscious about this. We really, Denise and I, decided to make this bill just so logical and common sense, even though we knew that it would it would be game changing. And we had other of my colleagues, Scott Wiener, who I'm close to, but I'm sure you've read about many times because he's a lot of people think of him as a flamethrower. He would always do these bills that would X number of stories must be able to be allowed, if this a quarter block from transit or whatever. And anyway, and there were about 3 or 4 other bills housing bills going through the legislature at that time that were like, people would, that's too extreme. And so they were the MacGuffin to 330. And 330 had penalties for cities. It had all kinds of things, but you had to really look at it close, and you had to understand housing to really get it, what it was trying to do. And I never underestimated, meaning lied or anything in committee and such. I was very clear about what its intent was, but all the attention was on these scary ones. And so mine went through pretty easy. And so that was, yeah.
In the end, who were the opponents?
There is a organization in SoCal that funds other organizations. It's an organization, it's actually the AIDS Foundation, which seems funny, but the AIDS Foundation is run by a guy who owns a whole lot of properties, rental properties mostly, and other properties all through the LA area. And he just has he was very anti any state housing law. And then he started, and he also he had a particular beef with Scott Wiener. So he started funding. He has a lot of money, this guy, and his foundation is huge. So you think AIDS Foundation, but he started funding these other organizations. So, Berkeley at the time, Livable Berkeley morphed into things like YIMBY and such. But he started funding these things, these groups all through the LA area that were like livable neighborhoods, but they were really very, and I don't mean this to insult them, but they were very NIMBY, very not in my backyard type of organizations. And he started funding them, and they started showing up to the Capitol. So those were who were opposing. But since most of them would come up and say, Brentwood, Beverly Hills, places like that, Monticello, most of my colleagues were like, you're going to stop. So it didn't work very well for them.
Group of opponents, I guess, California League of Cities.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm sorry. During that time period, it's not so much now. The League of Cities has matured some, or its politics has changed. But those of us who were trying to do housing bills, we just expected the League of Cities to oppose, and we used to call them the plague of cities. And but like I said, it's changed now. But it was very much dominated by council members from very small communities that really didn't want any housing.
At the time, the league said that they weren't opposed to the premise, but the process of SB 330, saying developers would most likely pocket the savings and enhance their profits while not producing affordable housing. So in response to them, and there was someone else who rather unkindly called you the queen of cost shifting, and that it was a terrible bill. Do you feel that developers have benefited?
So now, remember, I got elected to the Berkeley City Council in the 80s. I was one of the people that helped design Berkeley's rent control laws. And I imagine this might sound a little contrary to people considering how much I've done on housing. I still support rent control. So in the housing world, some people might consider me a bit of a contradiction, but I want housing to be affordable. And so then people go, well, but developers are just about making big profits and they don't care about people and all they want to do is just build something and make a lot of money. Well, developers can't make a lot of money unless people buy or rent their units. So, if a developer overprices something, they can't make any money. That's number one. Number two, I think a lot of us fail to appreciate that how we get most affordable housing, not all, but so there were times in the past where the federal government put more money towards subsidized housing. It was very little money from the federal government towards affordable units or Section 8 or that kind of thing. Very little. So the building of housing, the financing of housing in the US and in the state of California is private. It's private money. So how do we get them to, because with private money, by and large, the people that build solely and only affordable are nonprofit affordable housing developers. And they put together all kinds of tax credits and various things to make their thing work, but it's few and far between. You don't see many projects that are all affordable because of that. So how else do you get affordable units? You get affordable units because you put requirements on the developer. You say, developer, I'm going to let you build X amount over here, which, according to the projections I see, are going to give you a good return on your investment. And in return, you got to put 10% of those units, or 10% more, I give you a bonus, or 20% more, or what have you, as affordable for whatever, a certain AMI. And that's how we get affordable housing. That's how we get subsidized housing now. It's from the private sector. But we have to let them build something and make some money, get a return in order to do that. So when I would hear these criticisms, I'd think, okay, well, maybe you were like me back in the 80s and you didn't really understand housing financing. It can happen. I mean, we learn, we grow.
Speaking of growing, so originally it was SB 330, and then it would have sunsetted at the end of this year. Right. So then with SB 8, it was extended through 2029.
Or 29, is that? Okay,
yeah, so that it ends January 30, 2030. There were some other changes as well.
Right. So some of the changes, I wanted to make sure, because it passed right before the pandemic, and during the pandemic, not that much housing got built anywhere. So I wanted it to really have a chance to work for a while. So, and fortunately my colleagues agreed, so extend it to 2029. And the legislature at that point could extend it beyond. It's up to them. I won't be there. Term limits. But we also put a few more teeth into the enforcement capability and the fines, so that if cities resisted, and there's a famous situation in Livermore where one particular, mostly one woman with her money, but she got a number of residents to be sort of the front for her, just kept a project that the city council of Livermore had passed a number of times unanimously, that met their zoning rules, that would have been 100% affordable, and this person was able to keep it from being approved for 15 years. And so we put some things in it to add some teeth for enforcement.
So most recently, very recently, just 2-3 weeks ago, SB 1211 passed and was signed by the governor regarding ADUs on multifamily plots.
Right.
How do you see in general the role of accessory dwelling units, which I know you shared, you have built one in your own home for your daughter. How do you see those fitting within the solution to California's housing situation?
Sure. Well, ADUs before, and the state, while my name is only as co-author on a number of the bills, basically my friend Denise and I wrote all the major ADU legislation. The first legislation that Senator Bob Wieckowski carried, then Assemblymember Phil Ting, and then I continued to carry. So almost all of the rules changes around ADUs since 2015 were laws that, with the help of some planners in Santa Rosa, city planners in Santa Rosa, a couple of other, Deborah Sanderson, who was a planner here in the city of Berkeley, and a professor in the School of Planning here at Cal. Anyway, we're the ones who, pretty much were the architects of those laws. And the reason is we saw, like Scott and others, efforts to try to increase density, and we just thought, a lot of people are living in homes that are way more square footage than they really need, but they really feel like they can't move because of property taxes or any number of reasons, or they want to stay in that community. And if they could convert more of their home into an ADU, they could stay there, but then they could add some units, some housing for people. And then of course, there's always that desire by many people, like, I need as my parent is aging or another relative is aging, wouldn't it be great to have them here near me? So wouldn't I like to have a unit for that purpose? Or now so many of our kids, they can't afford to live somewhere, and so rather than moving back into the bedroom they grew up in, could we convert that little studio in the backyard into somewhere they could live? And so the data was out there of how much desire there was for that, and also how many people just did it illegally. And the illegal units are not all that great because, either they don't meet code or whatever reasons. And so Denise and I thought, this is a great way to use existing residential properties to add some units. And we knew how many were in Berkeley. Even though Berkeley resisted changing the city law, we knew how many lots in Berkeley had these, what they call granny flats or mother-in-law units, most of them illegal. So, and of course, you rented those at your peril, because if you rented them and then you got in a dispute, that person got in a dispute with you, they could go and, turn you into the city, which I know many people have had terrible headaches about that because, whatever. So Denise and I thought, okay, look, we got to make this easier, and we know some cities will resist, so we have to make it kind of a by right if they're a certain size and such, and so that's what we did. Now, the ADUs, and always originally those first concepts were around like single family homes or duplex type properties. But then over time we saw, now this is not so much the case on the multifamily buildings in Berkeley, but if you take like Walnut Creek as just an example, some of the multifamily properties that were built there, say in the 70s or 80s, have lots of, it's nice, but they have lots of space, lots of space that didn't get covered, isn't either they had like rec rooms or community rooms or all kinds of special rooms that at that point there was desire for, but now are not even being utilized. And so, but unless the code changed, the owner of the property couldn't convert that into habitable space. And so we started looking at the potential to have multifamily properties that had this underutilized space or that had other spaces that were underutilized be able to put more units. So we conceived of ADUs on multifamily properties. So the bill I just did increased the number that could be what they call by right. And it's only 8. It goes up to 8, which is not a, an outrageous number. And if you want to do a whole lot more, you still have to go through all the city's planning process. But that's what the latest bill does.
I listened to your sort of farewell to your colleagues. And one of the things you charged them and your successor was be bold, that your constituents demand that. They've demanded it of you, and you're asking for your successor to be bold. How would you suggest that they be bold in following up in the housing arena?
Well, on the housing arena, we've done a lot. It's not that we've not done, there's still more to do. I think the be bold right now is around our sentencing laws. California still has the highest per capita rate of incarceration. When I was elected in 2008, we had about 175,000 people in our state prisons. Now we're down to 90,000, 92,000. So we're down, but it's still a huge number. And we spend about 140,000 per person. Now imagine if you spent a fraction of that for our unhoused people, or for our people with mental illness, or something like that, which unfortunately a good number of substance use disorder, a good number of, not all, but a good number of people that we have incarcerated or jailed have any one of those 3 problems. But we are seeing this wave right now. Like there's a measure on the ballot, Prop 36, which I'd recommend you look at the LA Times or the SACB, both just editorialized against it. But the polls are showing, people during the pandemic, there was an uptick in crime. And unfortunately, there was a real uptick in Oakland, which is only now just beginning to go down. So people were legitimately scared, nervous. And I don't mean to minimize it, but it was a blip. And overall, crime is down and has been down for the last 20 or odd years. And what caused our prison population to go up was the war on drugs. And Prop 36 is a return to the war on drugs, because it would turn many of the drug sentences that used to be felonies, that then were converted to misdemeanors or what they call wobblers. The DA would have the ability to charge as a felony if it was really egregious. It would turn them all back into felonies, which means you go to state prison at the cost that I was describing. But legislators, of course, they want to be reelected, and they go like this, and they think, okay, well, everybody's, back to be hard on crime, so we better pass this kind of thing. Instead of, no, you could use that money for substance treatment programs, for housing with services, for any number of things that would lessen the people that are either, and I don't mean to say this, that are annoying or harassing you on the street or in the BART that makes you uncomfortable in BART and such, that if we had these kinds of abilities to serve them in a way other than jail or prison, and those other ways to serve them are far cheaper, we would be a lot better off. But if we go back to long sentences, we're going to be spending the money just on incarcerating them. So that's the area where I really feel people need to be bold. and my successors, and also the people who are still in the legislature. And we haven't talked about it yet, but I am very proud of a lot of the very good things I've done around that criminal justice space.
Yes. And in fact, that was going to be one of my next questions, so thank you. Yes. Let's switch now to the other major topic we want to be sure to cover, which is your involvement with environmental issues. We already mentioned the ban on styrofoam. You've been very active in the ban on plastics.
Berkeley was the first city in U.S. and had the first McDonald's.
Yeah.
And because McDonald's, so this is back in '88, and because McDonald's policy is to have uniformity everywhere, they went styro-free across the nation.
Yay.
Yeah.
Yes. I've been proud to have Martin Bork here twice, and was sorry he can't be here tonight. He wasn't feeling well, but to support the ban on plastics and try to encourage people to find ways to reduce plastic in your lives. So I was very pleased to see one of the bills that the governor just signed was SB 59 on bidirectional charging. Now this may be one, I'm just curious by show of hands, how many people, when you say bidirectional charging, what does that mean? No, shake of heads. Okay. Oh, we've got a couple in the back room. Good. Well, up until recently, it was mostly people with F-150 Ford trucks, which are not a lot of people in Berkeley, probably other than contractors, so that you could basically, if there were a power outage, the battery in that truck would run your house for up to 4 days. But there are a lot of other cars and batteries that aren't quite so big and expensive that would have that power. So you want to talk about that?
So clearly, we're on a quest now to electrify our transportation. And it's not going to happen overnight, but EV sales are, more Californians buy EVs than other residents of other states. And the interesting thing about your electric vehicle is that battery in that electric vehicle, even if you're buying a Leaf, so one of the smaller ones, or if you buy the F-150 truck or the BMW, those batteries have 6 to 10 times the capacity of that Tesla battery pack you might have bought. You maybe
and it's
bought
a lot
Tesla,
more expensive.
Yes, you might have bought the Tesla battery pack because you wanted to make sure that when the fires happened and you didn't have the outage, so you got that Tesla battery pack. Well, if you had a Leaf, a Nissan Leaf, you could have used your Nissan Leaf to power your house, because Nissan's Leafs have always been bidirectional, instead of buying the mounted on the side of your house battery pack. So a lot of EVs, not all, have this capability already. But I wanted to make sure, as California keeps subsidizing EVs and promoting them, that all the EVs sold in California would have this capability. So you wouldn't have to go to a whole lot of trouble. You can convert any EV to be what they call bidirectional capability. Every battery has it. It's just that within the electronics of the car, there's some software changes, and most of us don't want to mess our car up. So, but there are a lot of, again, I'm not going to recommend it, but there are a lot of DIY manuals and off on the internet. But I just thought, no, all the EVs should be bidirectional. And all Teslas will be by model 2025. So next model year, all will be. And others are announcing this. So the benefit of that is that they're mini power plants on wheels. And whether you use it, say, for example, as electricity rates go up, and say we have these horrible hot days, which we're going to continue to have, maybe you would use it just those 2-3 hours where you wanted to turn on some air conditioning. And I know not too many of us have air conditioning, but we're probably starting to invest in it, right? But then the rates are so high during that time that you want the air conditioning most. So you could flip on to your battery instead. And then when you turn off the air conditioning, you charge the battery at night, your car, when the rates are cheaper and when there's not a big demand on the grid. So that's the benefit of the bidirectional. And so we've talked a lot so far about housing. We've talked about my criminal justice work, but I also have this weird policy wonk stuff on energy, which is really one of my passions. And so I carry these wonky bills like that.
That's quite a good wonky bill, though.
Yeah.
As you said, right now, if people want to use some of the non-Teslas, they have to take the risk of invalidating the warranty on the car. So that will no longer be the case. So let's see. One of the questions that came in, and was one that I already had on my list, as we've watched with rapt attention or horror the run-up to the nationwide election, what would you, as a East Bay-based woman politician, say to another East Bay-based woman politician if you had the opportunity to share something or give a bit of advice?
Well, I was thrilled to see Claudia Sheinbaum elected in Mexico as the first woman leader of the country of Mexico in what we consider, a lot of Latin American countries, we consider very macho. And I think if Mexico can elect its woman president, we should be able to also. And I think I agree with the New York Times editorial. If we care about democracy, we'll elect Kamala.
We can only pray. Sort of broader question. I know this is something you've been involved in pretty much throughout your career. It's just trying to encourage more women to get involved in politics, involved in public service. Is that something that you might be getting more involved in, or what would you like to comment about that?
Well, I guess I am a bit of a workaholic, but
really,
I've tended to endorse women more than men, not solely and only, but by and large, and to recruit women. So when I got in the legislature in 2008, and there's 120 total legislators, so 80 in the Assembly, 40 in the Senate, there were 22 women, 22 out of 120. This is California. And I thought, that's ridiculous. What's wrong with us? And there was a women's caucus, but we were the only caucus. There's a Black caucus, a Latino caucus, a LGBTQ caucus. The women were the only caucus that didn't endorse candidates. And we didn't have a PAC. So we weren't trying to really, a woman in the Assembly then, Noreen Evans, I said, Noreen, we got to get this caucus has got to start getting active. So we convinced the caucus to endorse candidates. We created a PAC called Women in Power, still existent today. And it took us a few years, but by the time my last year in the Assembly, which was 2014, a group of us, Noreen had already left, but a group of us women, and a couple of them are termed out this year like me, we just said, we are going to stay fixated on increasing the number of women. We had gotten it up to 28. So I'd left in 14 with 28. But we said, okay, we're just going to stay completely focused. And we started partnering with groups around the state like Close the Gap and a group called Emerge, which trained Democratic women to run for office, and lots of groups like that. And we raised money for that PAC. So we got the women to endorse the woman. We gave her money. We go around to other people to get money. We just started doing that and going up and down the state for every district. And it would make, some of my colleagues would get mad because we were like, no, we only endorse women, and we've got to increase this number of women. Well, this year we have 50 women in the legislature. So between 14 and 24, it took us 10 years, we got to 50. Next year already, we already know, because most of these women, they're not yet taken office, but they're in seats where they're safe, they're going to win. We'll have 58, so just too short of parity, and the Senate will have 20 women, gender parity.
Excellent.
And I'm chair of the Women's Caucus, and I have been for the last 4 years.
Well done. Well done. Last week, David and I went to a fundraiser for the Ecology Center, showed a film that was recently done, From the Sidewalk to the Sun, I think was the name. And it followed a group of local precinct walkers, basically, about the issue of sugar drinks.
Ah, the soda, yeah.
Yeah, and it really followed the unfortunate path. So in Berkeley in 2014, the sugar soda bill passed with a 76 majority. I mean, it overwhelmingly was endorsed here. And then the industry got really unhappy about that and looking at what the precedent might be. And then in 2018 came up with this Affordable Grocery Act, the biggest misnomer we might ever have encountered, which was really trying to keep any city from doing the same thing.
Not just trying, it was explicit. It was explicit. The measure would basically preempt any local action to put in a soda tax. And at that time, Richmond, I think Richmond, Oakland, El Cerrito, all of them were considering, had on the ballot, I guess, so it would have nullified them.
And the way that happened was stunning.
Yeah.
You want to talk? It was in the assembly, so
right.
We don't hold you responsible.
Yes.
But this is the sort of thing people really need to hear about.
So you could, if somebody listening could have critiqued my earlier answer about how you can be successful in the legislature, because I didn't bring up I said you had to raise money, but I didn't bring up the influence of really big moneyed interests. And when those moneyed interests joined together, and so in this case you had Coca-Cola, the American Beverage Association, you had a lot of the food companies, because orange juice has sugar in it. All of these beverages have sugar in them. And every and any company that made these beverages all linked together to basically try to get this bill, which they were successful, through to preempt any locality, because they saw, Berkeley's, the data is great. There is a big reduction in sugar soda drinking in Berkeley, and the tax generates good money for our public health, our community public health programs.
And there was also a reduction in diabetes. Yes,
and a reduction in diabetes. So, it's a really good thing. But of course, it was really going to affect their bottom line. So when those kind of moneyed interests, right, and we've seen oil do this again and again. I was in Sacramento today because we're trying to pass the governor's proposed bill that would try to help minimize or eliminate the price spikes that the oil companies, the refineries, do on California gasoline. Our prices are so much higher than everywhere. And of course, the oil companies are going crazy and threatening that they'll pull refineries out of California. But anyway, so the moneyed interests are so powerful in the Capitol, and sometimes they're resisted. The legislature is going to pass the governor's bill, so the oil companies right now have not been successful in that. Who knows what next? But those beverage companies, they prevailed. And it was really terrible.
Yeah, it was pretty shocking. I recently came across a headline, I think it was Cal Matters. California legislature's unwritten rule: negotiate in secret with lobbyists, not in public. And what followed was a discussion about, similar things to that, and a culture that dealt with things behind the scenes, encouraging things to be amended behind the scenes, not in front of the public.
Right.
In fact, Senate President Pro Tem Mike McGuire acknowledged to Cal Matters that he requested, quote, policy committee chairpersons and bill authors work to secure potential amendments prior to the public hearing in order to improve the quality of legislation.
Yeah.
Is it your belief that it does improve the quality of legislation?
It's like so many things, I suppose it's a context, but in general, no. And we would be much better off with public financing of elections. Maine and Arizona have public financing of elections. Maine and Arizona have both had women governors too. Interestingly, California hasn't. But this is another reason I love representing this district, because not only are people very civic engaged and they're voters, they realize that, they might not, obviously our district really wants public financing and they don't like the fact that there's money in politics, but they're willing to support those of us who are running and give us contributions. So we, people like myself and our other local elected, we don't have to rely on, we don't have to go to tobacco or oil or various of these other entities for money to get elected. But a lot of folks represent districts where there just isn't that civic engagement, and where their residents, it's just an anathema to them that they'd ever write a check to someone. And yet you need so much money to run that they then get dependent on, what some association or then there's all kinds of them. And you'll notice in the mailers that you're getting at your house now, you'll look at the bottom, it'll be a mailer for somebody or a measure, and then you'll see on the bottom who's really funding it. And it isn't that person's campaign, it's some other organizations or entities, whether it's the Realtors or California Apartment Association or, any number of other, the CMA, the California Medical Association is another one, or the California Business Roundtable, which means the largest corporate entities, or the California Chamber of Commerce, again, no small businesses there, things like that, and they'll be funding those things.
Yeah. I'm seeing we've pretty much already run out of time, but I am going to ask a couple of the questions, and then Senator Skinner has generously agreed to stay after for refreshments, and you can ask her individual questions. So I'll ask a specific one and a general one. So the specific one, Senator Skinner, you said you're an environmentalist, and yet you voted for PG&E's new uncapped fixed grid fee. This new $24 plus fee will hurt the working class, seniors, renters, and people who live in small homes. It punished us for saving energy and won't encourage electrification. Why did you side with PG&E?
The fixed fee was a part of a budget trailer bill. I was budget chair at the time. And the budget is different than other bills. That is one that is negotiated by many, many parties, including the governor's office, the members in both houses, and it's I don't think there's any member who could ever sit before you and say that when they voted on the budget bills, that every single thing in every budget bill they were happy to and proudly voted yes on. No, it's the one kind of omnibus thing where you got to craft. This is the part of crafting, getting to some yeses. Now, there was the promise, and we'll see. You may have seen in the news that people are going to get some rebates from PG&E, that these fixed charges were going to allow them to smooth over the rates. But that's really up to not really up to, but we're dependent on what the PUC decides. And I have to say, I've not been happy with what the CPUC's decisions recently, where they've continued to grant PG&E rate increases, even though we gave that fixed charge. And part of the purpose of that fixed charge was to either, have either none of those rate increases or at least much more moderate. So it's like so many things in life. There's so many players. But California, I mean, if Governor Newsom, for example, he has the goal to electrify, and he's not going to pull it off with rates going up the way they are. So this is something that's really going to have to be confronted. And if I were not termed out and remaining in the legislature, it is what I would focus on the next 2 years.
Okay. You've given us a good sense of just how hard it is to do your job. As you said, you sometimes have to vote for things that you're not proud to vote for. There's a lot of hard work, even though you described the local level as being harder. Facing that kind of controversy is pretty difficult. So I'm sure there are many of us who would thank you for that, but it's going to turn it into a question, which is, given the difficulty and the wonderfully high salaries and perks, what advice would you give to someone considering running for an elected office?
Have a tough skin, because, well, first and foremost, no lobbyist is your friend. Even if after your time in office you continue to have, some social time with them or something, they're doing their job. You always have to remember, what interest is X or Y serving? And when as a lobbyist, if you're being paid by a client to do something. So the very first thing I always remind all my new members is, that person may be so sweet to you, may whatever, compliment you, say what a great rising star you are, whatever it is, and they may be sincere, but who cares? Just you got to look at what they're bringing before you and remember who's paying them. It doesn't mean that what they're advocating is necessarily bad or that you're going to disagree, but you've got to remember they're being paid to come and see you. They're being paid, and they've got to deliver something. So that's one. Another one is, the tough skin is just, don't be scared of your shadow. No, you're going to piss somebody off. And when I say somebody, I'm talking about these moneyed interests, because what the fear is, so I just mentioned, you get these mailers and you see on the bottom who's funding them. The fear of a lot of members is, I can't vote against that, because if I vote against it, that group in the next election is going to fund those mailers to take me out. So you have to do your good constituent work to, show your voters that you're here for them. And that's partly your district office and how responsive they are to your constituents. So do your good constituent work. Don't ignore your constituents, but then be willing to say no, even if that means, but be polite. So it's like, I would call, not every lobbyist, but some of them never expected my vote, so you don't have to worry about it. I represent Berkeley, and I was never going to ever vote with them. Oil companies are a great example. But for others, I would say, look, I'm not with you on this. And I'm letting you know in advance, don't waste your breath. It's not a disrespect. We're in two different places, and I'm not with you. And it's possible there'll be another issue where I can be with you, but I'm not with you now. And you might say it a different way, but you let them know. They respect that. Then they know they're doing vote counting too. Then they know they got to go to some other people. Don't keep them guessing, and stand by your word always. And then you're going to have less likely that they come after you. No guarantees, but less likely. And so that's what I try to train new members about.
Sounds like good advice. Most of you here know that our club was founded by a group of women, strong-minded, people who we would now call environmentalists. That word didn't exist then. Women who fought to keep the development, especially here in North Berkeley, by respecting basically the tenets of the Ohlone people on whose land we stand, keeping the rocky outcroppings, keeping the topography as it was. And I'm convinced that if Senator Nancy Skinner had been around 125 years ago, we are just celebrating our 125th anniversary with this book, that she would have been an early Hillside Club member. So instead, we now make her our newest Hillside Club member, in thanks for your presentation. And with a copy of our recently, right off the press, book, The Hillside Club Companion. I'm pleased to say my husband, David Mostardi, our club historian, Barry Endick, and there he is, Michael Scharf, were the three co-conspirators who made it happen. I hope you will all enjoy it, and thank you for our evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
We hope that now you're officially a member, that we'll get to see you around in your unofficial capacity. So,
Great.
And with that, we invite you all to have some refreshments and to ask any other questions. And thank you for coming this evening.